He stood 6'6" of gristle and bear hide, blocking the cabin door. She had a choice: freeze in the Colorado mud, or surrender to a man whose hands could snap her spine like dry kindling. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was survival. And the night was just beginning. Clara gripped the canvas handle of her valise. The stiff leather strap cut deep into the meat of her palm. Good. The sharp, biting pain kept her anchored. The stagecoach driver spat a stream of black tobacco into the slush, kicked the iron brake release, and didn't bother looking back. The carriage lurched forward, the heavy wheels churning up a thick soup of mud and horse manure, leaving her entirely alone in the fading light of Bitter Creek. Bitter Creek was a generous name for 6 unpainted timber buildings slowly sinking into the rot of the Rockies. The wind howled down through the canyon, carrying the bitter scent of wood smoke, wet pine needles, and stale rot-gut whiskey. Clara pulled her thin woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her teeth clicked together. She wasn't sure if it was the freezing altitude or the sheer blinding terror of what she had just done. She was 21. She had exactly 3 coins left in her coin purse, a cough that wouldn't clear, and a piece of crumpled telegraph paper in her pocket promising a husband. The tavern door swung open. The hinges shrieked, a high-pitched scrape of rusted iron that made Clara flinch. Out stepped the magistrate, a man with a red, bulbous nose and a woolen coat dusted in dandruff. Behind him came the man who had paid her fare. Clara stopped breathing. The man didn't just walk out of the tavern. He eclipsed the doorway. He had to duck to avoid taking the doorframe with him. He wore a heavy coat made of patched buffalo hide, the fur matted and smelling fiercely of damp earth, slaughtered game, and old blood. A thick, dark beard obscured most of his face, leaving only a pair of eyes the color of dirty river ice. He didn't look at her like a bride. He looked at her the way a man inspects a winter coat, to see if the seams will hold against a blizzard. "This is her?" his voice rumbled. It didn't sound like a human voice. It sounded like boulders grinding together at the bottom of a dry creek bed. "Clara Harding," the magistrate chirped, rubbing his hands together. "As agreed, Boone, paid in full. She's breathing, she's upright, and she's got all her teeth. That's a damn sight better than the last one they sent." Boone didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. He took one massive step down off the porch, his heavy leather boots sinking 2 inches into the freezing mud. He stopped 3 feet from her. The sheer mass of him blocked out the wind. Clara stared at his chest, refusing to tilt her head up. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Run!" her instinct screamed. "Run back down the mountain." But there was nowhere to run. Back east was starvation. Back east was the textile mill that had claimed 2 of her fingers on her left hand and the lives of 3 of her friends. Here, there was only Boone. "You're small," Boone said. A statement of fact. No disappointment, no pity. Just a cold observation. "I eat less," Clara fired back. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. "And I don't break easily." Boone's pale eyes shifted, catching the defiant set of her new jaw. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his gaze. He reached into his coat, pulled out a heavy pouch that clinked with dull metal, and tossed it to the magistrate. "Sign the paper," Boone said. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took 40 seconds. Clara signed her name on a piece of parchment that smelled of stale beer. Boone made a messy, jagged X next to it. No vows. No rings. Just a transfer of property. "Wagon's out back," Boone muttered, turning away. He didn't offer to take her bag. Clara followed him. Her boots, thin and practically worn through at the soles, slid in the frozen muck. She dragged her valise, the canvas scraping against rocks. The wagon was a brutal, unsprung thing attached to a draft horse that looked as mean and scarred as its owner. Boone hoisted himself up onto the buckboard. The entire wagon groaned under his weight. He looked down at her, waiting. Clara threw her bag into the back. She gripped the cold iron rail of the seat and tried to pull herself up. Her arms trembled. The cold had settled into her joints. She slipped, her knee banging hard against the wooden wheel hub. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. Before she could try again, a hand clamped onto her bicep. The grip was terrifying, thick, calloused fingers that felt like warm iron bands. Boone hoisted her up with one arm, pulling her through the air as effortlessly as if she were a sack of dry flour. He deposited her onto the hard wooden bench next to him. He let go immediately. The residual heat from his hand burned through the thin fabric of her sleeve. "Don't fall off," he grunted, and snapped the reins. The journey up the mountain took 3 hours. It was a brutal, bone-rattling ascent into the black pines. The temperature plummeted with every mile. Clara sat rigid, her hands tucked under her armpits, shivering violently. She kept her eyes fixed on the horse's swaying hindquarters. She couldn't bring herself to look at the man sitting beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't offer her a blanket. He just drove the horse, his massive frame absorbing the violent jolts of the rocky trail. The silence between them wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, pregnant with the terrifying reality of what was waiting for them at the top of the timberline. A virgin from the soot-stained streets of a dying industrial town, and a mountain man who looked like he hadn't spoken to a human being in a decade. Clara closed her eyes. "You chose this," she reminded herself. "You chose this over starving in a gutter." But as the wind picked up, howling through the pines like a dying animal, she wondered if she had just traded one kind of death for another. The cabin appeared suddenly, a low, squat structure of peeled pine logs, practically swallowed by the surrounding forest. It was dug into the side of the mountain, fortified against the wind. It looked less like a home and more like a bunker. Boone pulled back on the reins. The horse blew out a heavy breath, white vapor pluming in the freezing air. "Get inside," Boone said. He hopped down, the ground crunching under his boots, and went to unhitch the horse. Clara grabbed her valise and scrambled down. Her legs were numb. She practically fell against the side of the wagon, biting her lip to keep from crying out as blood rushed back into her frozen calves. She stumbled toward the heavy plank door, pushed down the iron latch, and stepped inside. It was pitch black and colder than the air outside. The air inside was thick and stagnant, smelling heavily of pine resin, old ash, tanned hides, and a faint, sharp tang of metallic blood. It was the lair of a predator. Clara stood by the door, clutching her bag to her chest, paralyzed by the darkness. She didn't dare move. 5 minutes later, the door shoved open behind her. Boone filled the frame, bringing the howling wind in with him. He pushed past her, brushing her shoulder. The sheer physical density of him knocked her a half-step sideways. He struck a sulfur match against the wall. The flame flared blue, then yellow, illuminating his scarred, weathered face. He touched the match to a kerosene lantern on a rough-hewn table. Light spilled across the single room. It was painfully Spartan. A cast-iron stove sat in the center. A table with one chair. A rack of heavy rifles. And in the corner, a bed. It wasn't a cot. It was a massive frame of raw timber, piled high with heavy bear and wolf pelts. It took up a third of the room. Clara stared at the bed. Her throat closed up. The reality of the transaction crashed down on her with the weight of an avalanche. Boone walked to the stove, opened the grate, and began throwing in split kindling. His movements were economic, practiced. Within minutes, a fire roared to life, the iron popping and ticking as it heated. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to the single chair. Clara didn't argue. She sat. The wood of the chair was rough, snagging her skirt. Boone took a battered tin coffee pot, poured water from a bucket, and set it on the stove. He didn't look at her. He pulled off his heavy buffalo coat, tossing it onto a wooden peg. Underneath, he wore a thick flannel shirt, stained with sweat and axe grease, stretched tight across shoulders that seemed impossibly broad. His forearms were corded with thick veins, his hands scarred and massive. He poured the boiling water into a tin cup and pushed it across the table toward her. "Drink. You're blue." Clara took the cup. The metal burned her raw palms, but she welcomed the pain. She took a sip. It was just hot water, tasting faintly of rust, but it warmed the icy knot in her chest. Boone stood by the stove, letting the heat wash over him. He watched her. His pale eyes tracked every micro movement she made, the tremor in her hands, the way she kept glancing at the door, the way her eyes inevitably drifted back to the massive bed in the corner. "You're terrified," he stated. Again, no emotion, just fact. "I am practical," Clara lied, her voice cracking. Boone let out a low, rough sound. It might have been a scoff. Practical women don't shake so hard they spill their water. Clara looked down. She hadn't realized water was sloshing over the rim of the cup onto her dress. She set the tin down with a harsh clatter. She was tired. She was freezing. And suddenly, the cynicism that had kept her alive in the mills flared up, burning away the terror. "What do you expect?" she snapped, surprising herself. Her voice echoed in the small, stifling cabin. "Look at you. Look at this place. I answered an advertisement for a husband, not a warden. You haven't said 5 words to me. You look at me like I'm a lame horse you're thinking about putting down. And that." She pointed a trembling finger at the massive pile of furs in the corner. "That is." She choked on the words. She couldn't finish the thought. The suffocating intimacy of the cabin was closing in on her. He was too big. The space was too small. The inevitability of the night was paralyzing. Boone didn't move. He stood perfectly still, letting her outburst ring out against the logs. The fire hissed. Slowly, he walked toward her. Clara pushed back in her chair, her spine pressing hard against the vertical slats. He stopped right in front of her. Up close, he smelled of sweat, wood smoke, and a deep, earthy musk. He reached out. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for a blow, or a rough hand, dragging her up. Instead, she felt the coarse, calloused pad of his thumb brush against her jaw. The touch was shocking, not because it was rough, but because it was impossibly, painstakingly light. A man who could crush a wolf's skull was touching her like she was made of blown glass. She opened her eyes. He was looking down at her, the hard lines of his face cast in stark shadows by the lantern light. "I ain't a civilized man, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly hum that vibrated in her chest. "I don't know how to talk soft. I don't know how to court a woman. I know how to survive. I bought you because the winters here make a man crazy if he don't hear another breathing soul." He dropped his hand, stepping back slightly, giving her air. "I know what you're looking at," he said, nodding toward the bed. "I know what you think is going to happen. I'm a big man. I'm a rough man. I know I scare you." Clara stood up. Her legs were shaking, but she forced herself to meet his pale eyes. The sheer, overwhelming scale of him made her feel like a child. His chest was a wall of muscle and bone. His hands were weapons. She looked at his hands, then at the bed, and then back up at his face. She was a virgin. She knew the mechanics of it only from the crude whispers of the mill girls. She knew it hurt. She knew it was a duty. But looking at Boone, the sheer physics of it seemed impossible. It seemed like a violence she couldn't survive. Yet, the agonizingly gentle way he had just touched her jaw created a violent contradiction in her mind. He was a monster who touched her like a saint. She took a ragged breath. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her belly, but the cynical survivor in her took the wheel. She had made a bargain. She would not cower like a beaten dog. She stepped closer to him. The heat radiating off his body was intense. "You're too big," she whispered, her voice trembling violently, betraying her brave front. A tear leaked out, cutting a hot path down her dirty cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She stared up into his shocked, pale eyes. "You're too big, but I'll take it. Whatever this is, whatever you need. Let's just get it over with so I can sleep." Boone's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. He stared down at her, at the raw, terrified defiance in her small frame. He didn't see a conquered woman. He saw a cornered animal baring its teeth, offering its throat, while entirely ready to bite. The silence in the cabin stretched thin, pulling so tight it felt like a wire about to snap. Boone just stood there. The muscle in his jaw stopped jumping. His pale eyes locked onto the wet, tracks of tears slicing through the soot on her face. Then he swore. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, ugly, guttural sound in the back of his throat. He turned his back on her, the heavy floorboards protesting under his sudden shift in weight. Clara stood frozen. Her desperate, cynical offering hung in the air, pathetic and entirely ignored. She squeezed her fists, the stumps of her missing fingers aching in the cold. She had braced for violence. She had braced for the crushing weight of a man taking what he paid for. She hadn't braced for dismissal. Boone grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from a peg on the wall and slammed it onto the iron stove. Clara flinched at the sharp crack of metal on metal. He didn't look back at her. He reached into a wooden crate, pulled out a thick slab of salt pork, and hacked off 3 thick slices with a hunting knife that looked sharp enough to shave with. He threw the meat into the dry skillet. It immediately began to hiss and spit. "Sit down," Boone said. He didn't yell, but the command was absolute. Clara sank back into the rough wooden chair. Her knees simply gave out. "I didn't buy a whore," Boone said to the wall, his broad back completely blocking her view of the stove. The smell of frying fat hit the stagnant air, heavy, salty, and suddenly making Clara's stomach cramp with a violent, hollow ache. "And I don't bed women who look at me like I'm holding a hatchet to their neck. You're exhausted, you're frozen, and you're too damn skinny." He flipped the pork with the blade of his knife. Grease popped, stinging his bare forearm, but he didn't even flinch. "I bought a wife," he continued, the words rumbling deep in his chest. "I need someone to tend the fire when I'm checking the trap lines. I need someone to salt the meat so it don't rot. I need a breathing body in this cabin so the silence don't crack my skull open come February. That's the bargain. The rest of it." He stopped, scraping the skillet off the hottest part of the stove. "The rest of it ain't happening tonight." He plated the scorched pork on a battered tin dish, grabbed a heel of hard bread, and dropped the plate onto the table in front of her. He pushed a fork toward her hand. "Eat. Then you sleep." Clara stared at the grease pooling around the edges of the meat. Her mouth watered so violently it hurt. She picked up the fork with her trembling right hand, stabbed the pork, and shoved it into her mouth. It was blistering hot. It burned the roof of her mouth, tasted of heavy salt and iron, and was the best thing she had eaten in 3 days. Boone didn't eat. He retreated to the far corner of the cabin, sitting on a low wooden stool beside a stack of split logs. He pulled a rag and a tin of oil from a shelf and began breaking down a massive Winchester rifle. The sounds of the cabin settled into an uneasy rhythm, the wind howling against the logs, the fire popping, the rhythmic, metallic shuck-clack of Boone working the lever action of the rifle. Clara ate everything on the plate in under 2 minutes, wiping the grease up with the hard bread. As the heavy food hit her empty stomach, the adrenaline that had kept her upright began to crash. Her head swam. The exhaustion was absolute, sinking into her bones like lead water. She watched Boone from the corner of her eye. He was a terrifying sight in the dim lantern light. A massive, scarred creature of the woods, oiling a gun in the dark. Yet, he hadn't touched her. He had fed her. Her cynicism, honed sharp in the factories of Massachusetts, couldn't make sense of him. Men with power took what they wanted. That was the only rule she knew. This man had total power over her. He had a bill of sale in his pocket. There was no law within 30 miles. And yet, he sat in the corner, keeping his distance, letting her breathe. "I'm done," she croaked. Her voice sounded thin, frail. Boone didn't look up from the rifle barrel. "Bed's in the corner. Take off your boots and your outer dress. The wool's damp from the wagon. It'll freeze on you in the night when the fire dies down." Clara looked at the bed. The mountain of furs. "Where are you sleeping?" she asked. Boone finally looked at her. The lantern light caught the icy pale of his eyes. "In my bed. I ain't sleeping on the floor in my own cabin. It's big enough. Stay on your side." The fire began to die, glowing down to a pile of angry orange embers. Instantly, the cabin walls seemed to exhale, letting the brutal mountain cold seep through the chinking. Clara stood by the bed. She turned her back to the room. Her frozen fingers fumbled with the buttons at the collar of her heavy, soot-stained dress. It took agonizingly long. Every time she tugged a button free, a rush of freezing air hit her collarbone. Finally, the heavy wool pooled at her feet, leaving her in a thin, worn cotton chemise and woolen stockings. She scrambled into the bed, dragging the heavy pelts over her shoulders. The furs smelled violently of musk, dried earth, and man. They were incredibly heavy. It felt like being buried under a layer of dirt. The mattress, stuffed with dry pine needles and horsehair, crackled loudly under her weight. She pressed her back against the far wall of the cabin, making herself as small as humanly possible. A minute later, Boone stood up. He blew out the lantern. The darkness was absolute, thick and blinding. Clara heard the rustle of clothing, the heavy thud of his boots hitting the floorboards. Then, the massive wooden bed frame groaned. The mattress pitched violently to one side, as Boone's enormous weight settled onto it. He lay on the extreme opposite edge. Between them was 3 feet of empty space, under the heavy pelts. Clara lay rigid, staring up into the blackness. The cold was beginning to sink its teeth into her. Without the stove radiating heat, the cabin was little more than a wooden icebox. Her thin chemise offered zero protection. The pelts were heavy, but they were freezing to the touch. She began to shiver. At first, it was a subtle tremor in her jaw. Then her shoulders started to shake. Within 20 minutes, she was shuddering violently, her teeth clicking together in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. She curled into a tight ball, tucking her knees to her chest, desperately trying to hoard her own meager body heat. It wasn't working. Her toes were completely numb. A dull, throbbing pain settled into her hip joints. The silence of the cabin was broken only by the wind outside and the frantic rustling of the dry pine needles under her shaking body. "Stop it," Boone's voice rasped in the dark. It was a low, sleepy growl. I can't," Clara chattered, the words broken in half by her shivering. Another long, agonizing minute passed. Her shivers grew violent enough that the heavy bearskin over them began to shift. Boone let out a heavy sigh, the sound of a man deeply inconvenienced. The mattress shifted wildly. Before Clara could register what was happening, a massive hand clamped onto her hip. She gasped, a sharp intake of freezing air, as Boone effortlessly dragged her across the mattress. She fought, a weak, panic scramble, but she might as well have been fighting a glacier. He pulled her backward until her spine slammed against a wall of solid, searing heat. Boone wrapped one enormous, heavy arm around her waist, pinning her arms to her chest, and pulled her tight against him. He was wearing thick flannel long johns, but the heat radiating off him was nuclear. He felt like a cast-iron stove. Clara went totally rigid. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her breath seized in her throat. This was it. The rough hands. The breaking. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the horror. "Stop fighting," Boone muttered. His breath was warm against the crown of her head. He didn't move his hands. He didn't grope her. He just held her there, clamped tightly against his chest, a human blanket of muscle and heat. "You've got no meat on your bones. You'll freeze to death before sunrise." Clara lay paralyzed. The smell of him was overwhelming wood smoke, sweat, and something inherently wild. She waited for him to shift, to push her down, to take what he had bought. But he didn't. His breathing slowed. The heavy arm across her waist felt less like a cage and more like an anchor. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the violent shivering began to stop. The icy ache in her joints began to melt away, replaced by the overwhelming, heavy warmth of the man behind her. Sensation returned to her toes. Her jaw stopped trembling. She was in the bed of a terrifying stranger, hundreds of miles from anything she knew. She was entirely at his mercy. Her cynical mind screamed at her to stay awake, to stay guarded. But as the deep, rhythmic thump of Boone's heartbeat drummed steadily against her spine, her exhausted body betrayed her logic. The warmth was too good. The heavy, absolute safety of his grip was something she hadn't felt since she was a child. Clara let out a long, shaky breath. Her rigid muscles went slack. She sank back into the wall of his chest, closing her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she let the darkness take her without a fight. Clara survived the first night, but winter in the Rockies doesn't forgive, and neither do the demons from Boone's past. Will this brutal arrangement slowly forge a real bond, or will the isolation tear them apart before the spring thaw? Let me know in the comments if you think Clara made the right choice, surrendering to the warmth. If you want the next chapter of this gritty frontier romance, hit like, share with your book besties, and subscribe so you never miss a wild update.